January 7, 1945. Belgium. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood before a packed room of international correspondents inside his headquarters. The war in Western Europe had entered its final phase. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes had collapsed. The crisis was over. The alliance had survived. Montgomery had called the press conference himself. He was not there to provide a routine operational summary. He was there to define ownership of the victory. For nearly an hour, he spoke without notes. His tone was confident, controlled, and absolute. He described the opening of the German attack as a moment of American disarray. He described confusion, broken formations, and a situation that required immediate intervention. He then described himself. He said he had taken charge. He said he had reorganized the front. He said he had employed British forces to stabilize the situation. He said, repeatedly, that he had handled the situation. The implication was unmistakable. Without British command, the American armies would have failed. This was not an offhand remark. It was a constructed narrative delivered deliberately, sentence by sentence, to a global audience. Montgomery did not credit the American units that held the line. He did not mention the cost paid by American divisions in the snow. He did not acknowledge the counterattack that had already broken the German offensive before his press conference took place. What he did instead was claim authorship. Within hours, the transcript reached Allied headquarters. It reached American field commands. It reached Washington. The effect was immediate and explosive. Montgomery had not merely offended individuals. He had publicly challenged the legitimacy of American command in the largest battle the United States Army had ever fought. By the end of the day, the issue was no longer public relations. It was command authority. It was alliance stability. It was whether the Western Allied war effort could survive the consequences of a single decision made in front of microphones. That decision had already been made. The damage was already done. December 20th, 1944. The opportunity existed because the German offensive had overreached its own logistics and tempo. By that date, the German advance in the Ardennes had achieved surprise, but not decision. Fuel shortages were already constraining armored movement. German infantry formations were advancing faster than their supply columns could sustain. The road network inside the Bulge was congested, fragile, and exposed to air interdiction the moment the weather cleared. Militarily, the German plan depended on speed. It required American forces to remain disorganized long enough for German spearheads to reach the Meuse River. That window was measured in days, not weeks. Once the advance slowed, the German army lacked the reserves to exploit success or recover from containment. The Allied position, despite early shock, retained decisive advantages. The Americans still controlled the majority of their artillery, logistics, and command infrastructure. Units that had been pushed back were not destroyed. They were retreating in contact, forming new defensive lines, and buying time. The critical opportunity lay in coordination. The northern shoulder of the Bulge was not collapsing. It was unstable, but it was defensible. The terrain favored defense. Forests, narrow roads, and winter conditions limited German maneuver. A coherent command structure could stabilize the line long enough for counterattacks elsewhere to take effect. To the south, the opportunity was even clearer. American armored forces remained intact and mobile. They were positioned to strike the exposed flank of the German penetration. This required rapid decision-making, not structural overhaul. The forces were already there. They needed orders, not rescue. From a purely military standpoint, the optimal approach was containment in the north and decisive counterattack in the south. That was already underway before Montgomery fully assumed operational control. German momentum was slowing as early as December 19th. By the time command arrangements were clarified, the German offensive had already lost its strategic initiative. This mattered because it defined what Montgomery was inheriting. He did not arrive to salvage a lost front. He arrived to administer a situation that was stabilizing under its own weight. The opportunity was not to reinvent the battle, but to prevent further deterioration while American countermeasures took effect. His task was managerial, not visionary. He was positioned close to the northern sector. His headquarters could coordinate logistics, redistribute units, and formalize defensive lines. These were necessary actions, but they were not transformative. They did not create victory. They preserved space and time. The decisive military opportunity lay elsewhere. It lay in the mass of American forces pivoting south of the Bulge. It lay in restoring operational continuity and applying pressure where German forces were weakest. That opportunity was seized by American command without British intervention. This distinction is critical. The battlefield outcome was not in doubt by early January. German forces were already retreating. Their fuel was gone. Their reserves were spent. Their gamble had failed. What remained undecided was ownership of the narrative. Militarily, the situation required cooperation, restraint, and discipline at the command level. Any public claim of singular authorship risked undermining unity at precisely the moment when cohesion mattered more than brilliance. The opportunity Montgomery had was to consolidate quietly and withdraw gracefully once the emergency passed. Instead, he chose visibility. The warning did not come from emotion or hindsight. It came from preparation. Montgomery had spent the weeks before the German offensive arguing that Allied strategy was flawed. He believed the broad front advance diluted strength and invited counterattack. He had said so repeatedly in private correspondence and staff discussions. He had positioned himself as the commander who understood German operational behavior better than his peers. When the German attack began, Montgomery interpreted it not as surprise, but as confirmation. In his view, the Americans had advanced too far, too fast, without sufficient concentration. The German response, however desperate, validated his long-standing criticism of Allied dispersion. This shaped his assessment immediately. Upon assuming temporary control of the Northern American armies, Montgomery focused on order, boundaries, and command clarity. He prioritized firm defensive lines over local counterthrusts. He delayed forward movement until he believed coordination was absolute. He believed caution was not merely prudent, but morally necessary. From his perspective, the greatest danger was not German strength, but Allied impatience. Montgomery prepared for a battle of stabilization, not exploitation. He reorganized units into what he considered coherent formations. He insisted on deliberate planning cycles. He sought to reduce ambiguity, even at the cost of momentum. This approach was consistent with his record. He had always favored certainty over speed. His credibility rested on this consistency. He did not arrive improvising. He arrived applying a method he had used before, one that had brought success under different conditions. He believed that wars were lost through chaos, not caution. That belief had hardened into doctrine. What Montgomery underestimated was context. The American armies under his temporary control were not collapsing. They were absorbing shock and adapting rapidly. Their commanders were already executing contingency plans. Their logistics were strained but functional. Their counteroffensive capacity remained intact. Montgomery's preparation assumed a vacuum of leadership that did not exist. He believed he was preventing disaster. In reality, he was stepping into a process already underway. His actions refined the defense, but they did not originate it. His staff work improved coordination, but it did not alter the strategic trajectory of the battle. This distinction mattered because it shaped his later interpretation. Montgomery concluded that the absence of catastrophe proved the necessity of his intervention. He equated stabilization with salvation. He interpreted competence as indispensability. And because he had warned against Allied overextension before the attack, he believed outcome validated prediction. That belief would follow him out of the command room. By early January, Montgomery was convinced that he had been right all along. He believed the crisis had demonstrated the superiority of his method and the weakness of American command culture under stress. The warning he had issued privately, he now intended to state publicly. He did not see it as provocation. He saw it as correction. And that conviction would collide directly with the political reality of coalition warfare. The overrule did not arrive as a shouted command or a formal directive. It arrived as silence, delay, and political gravity. Montgomery's authority over American forces had always been conditional. It existed because Eisenhower allowed it to exist, and Eisenhower allowed it only because alliance mechanics demanded flexibility. That flexibility had limits, and those limits were not military. The moment Montgomery chose to define the Battle of the Bulge publicly, he crossed from operational necessity into institutional threat. Eisenhower understood this immediately. His role was not simply to win battles. It was to preserve the coalition long enough to win the war. The alliance rested on a fragile balance. American manpower and material paired with British prestige and continuity. That balance depended on mutual respect, or at least the appearance of it. Montgomery's press conference shattered that appearance. Within hours, Eisenhower was under pressure from every direction. American commanders were furious, not because their pride had been bruised, but because their authority had been publicly undermined. Soldiers who had fought and died were being recast as beneficiaries of British intervention. That narrative could not be contained at the front. It would travel home. At the same time, Eisenhower faced an equally dangerous constraint from London. Montgomery was not merely a field commander. He was a national symbol. He represented Britain's first major victory of the war and its continued relevance as a great power. Removing him would not be interpreted as discipline. It would be interpreted as humiliation. Churchill made that clear without needing to say it explicitly. The combined chiefs of staff structure ensured that any attempt to remove Montgomery would escalate instantly. What appeared to be a personnel decision would become a diplomatic crisis. Eisenhower did not possess unilateral freedom of action, no matter his title. This was the system asserting itself. Military logic favored decisive correction. Political logic demanded containment. Eisenhower was forced to choose between two unacceptable outcomes: tolerate insubordination or fracture the alliance. He attempted neither immediately. Instead, he stalled. He listened. He absorbed outrage. He allowed American anger to reach its peak while quietly assessing how far it would go. When Bradley arrived with his ultimatum, Eisenhower did not argue. He did not defend Montgomery. He understood that the American command structure was approaching its own breaking point. At that moment, the overrule became inevitable. Montgomery would not be publicly defended. He would not be allowed to shape future operations involving American forces. His influence would be constrained without being visibly severed. The alliance would survive, but the cost would be paid privately. No formal announcement was made. No dramatic confrontation occurred. The decision unfolded through letters, intermediaries, and conditional forgiveness. Montgomery believed authority flowed from competence and reputation. Eisenhower knew authority flowed from consent. The system sided with survival. And survival required that Montgomery be stopped without being destroyed. The consequence unfolded without spectacle, but with precision. Within days of the press conference, the practical effects of Montgomery's decision became visible across the Allied command. Trust collapsed first. Coordination followed. Orders were no longer received as neutral instructions, but as political signals. American commanders complied formally while disengaging mentally. The battlefield did not change. The war continued advancing toward Germany. But the command environment fractured. Bradley withdrew cooperation beyond the minimum required. Patton became openly hostile in private correspondence. Staff officers began routing information around Montgomery's headquarters rather than through it. Liaison officers reported delays, reinterpretations, and selective execution of directives. Nothing was insubordinate on paper. Everything was resistant in practice. This was the price of public humiliation. American soldiers did not mutiny. They did something more dangerous. They lost confidence that their leadership would defend them against allies. That sentiment traveled upward. Divisional commanders questioned whether future operations under British oversight would credit American sacrifice or exploit it. Eisenhower acted quietly. Montgomery's temporary authority over American forces was allowed to expire without ceremony. No announcement was made. The change was framed as a return to normal command arrangements. In reality, it was a boundary drawn in silence. From that point forward, Montgomery was excluded from strategic decisions involving American armies unless no alternative existed. Planning conferences proceeded without him. Resource allocations were decided before his input was solicited. His proposals were acknowledged, then delayed, then diluted. He remained in command of British and Canadian forces. He retained his rank. He retained public stature. What he lost was leverage. The operational consequences were immediate. When Allied forces prepared for the final crossings of the Rhine, Montgomery expected to lead the decisive effort. He had designed operations for months with that assumption. Instead, Eisenhower authorized multiple American crossings independent of Montgomery's timetable. Momentum shifted away from a single concentrated thrust and toward distributed advances. Montgomery objected. His objections were noted and set aside. the war ended without his culminating moment. The political consequences were longer lasting. Within British circles, Montgomery remained a hero. His press narrative held domestically. The controversy was minimized as a misunderstanding exacerbated by American sensitivity. Churchill defended him publicly and privately. No formal reprimand was issued. But within the Allied system, Montgomery became radioactive. American commanders would not serve under him again unless compelled. Eisenhower ensured they would not be. The precedent was clear. Montgomery could not be trusted with coalition authority beyond his national command. This outcome traced directly to the decision made on January 7th. No operational failure forced the change. No battlefield defeat justified it. Words had done what German armor could not. They had isolated a commander at the moment of victory. Montgomery never fully grasped this. He believed the apology he submitted resolved the crisis. He believed restraint by Eisenhower signaled acceptance. He mistook tolerance for forgiveness. In reality, the system had adapted around him. The Allied command learned how to function without requiring his cooperation. His presence became ornamental rather than essential. His influence narrowed as the war's end approached. By the time Germany surrendered, Montgomery stood on the sidelines of history's final act. He was present, but no longer central. Visible, but no longer decisive. The consequence was not dismissal. It was containment. The alliance survived. The war was won. But the command environment was permanently altered by a single assertion of ownership where none was required. The battlefield recorded victory. The command room recorded exclusion. And the distinction between those two records defined Montgomery's final months of the war. The post-war record stripped away any remaining ambiguity. After Germany's surrender, memoirs, correspondence, and declassified staff papers converged on the same conclusion. Montgomery had not been punished because punishment was politically impossible. He had been managed because removal would have damaged the alliance more than his continued presence. Eisenhower's own accounts were explicit. He never denied his anger. He never denied that Montgomery's press conference had crossed a line. What he emphasized instead was constraint. Supreme command, he wrote, did not mean unlimited authority. It meant operating inside a structure where national governments, public opinion, and symbolic figures imposed limits that no field manual addressed. Montgomery appeared frequently in post-war British narratives as a decisive architect of victory. That portrayal relied heavily on selective emphasis. His role in coalition command after January 1945 was consistently overstated. American records told a different story. Bradley's memoirs were restrained but unambiguous. He described the press conference as a breach of trust that could not be repaired. He noted that Montgomery was never again considered for command over American troops, regardless of circumstance. That exclusion was deliberate and permanent. Patton's private papers were less restrained. He regarded the incident as proof that Montgomery could not distinguish between national pride and coalition warfare. His view carried weight because it aligned with Eisenhower's subsequent actions, even when Eisenhower avoided public agreement. British records quietly acknowledged the damage. Churchill defended Montgomery in public, but his private correspondence reveals concern about the scale of American reaction. He understood that Montgomery's value as a symbol had become a liability. The very status that made him untouchable also made him dangerous. Montgomery's own writings are revealing in what they omit. He never fully acknowledged the near collapse of Allied command. He framed the episode as a misunderstanding amplified by American sensitivity. He emphasized his apology as evidence of magnanimity rather than necessity. He portrayed Eisenhower's restraint as validation. That interpretation did not survive comparison with operational records. After January 1945, Montgomery's strategic proposals increasingly bypassed American channels. His ideas were discussed, not adopted. His influence narrowed to his own army group. The major decisions that defined the war's final weeks were made elsewhere. This pattern persisted into the historical consensus. Professional military historians largely agreed that Montgomery's conduct during the press conference was more damaging than any battlefield error he committed during the war. Not because it changed outcomes on the ground, but because it exposed the fragility of coalition command. The documents show no conspiracy, no secret cabal. They show something more mundane and more decisive: institutional self-preservation. The alliance adjusted to remove a source of instability without provoking a crisis. Montgomery remained a field marshal. He remained celebrated at home. He remained visible in victory ceremonies. But the record is clear that his authority within the coalition had ended weeks before the war did. This was not recorded as a demotion. It was recorded as a redistribution of trust. The post-war narrative often simplifies coalition warfare into harmony and shared purpose. The documents contradict that simplification. They show that victory was maintained not through unity of character, but through containment of it. Montgomery survived the episode intact in rank and reputation. What he did not survive was relevance at the highest level of Allied decision-making. The record closes without drama. No court-martial. No dismissal. No reconciliation. Only a silent reconfiguration of power that ensured the war could end without further internal rupture. That is what the documents agree on. And that agreement has never been seriously challenged. The final verdict is narrow and complete. Bernard Montgomery was not nearly dismissed because of failure in battle. He was nearly dismissed because he violated the single rule that coalition command cannot survive without: restraint in victory. His decision on January 7th was not forced. No military necessity required it. No political directive demanded it. He chose to speak, and he chose to speak in a way that reassigned ownership of sacrifice. The system responded accordingly. Eisenhower did not defend him. He did not publicly rebuke him. He did something more effective. He removed Montgomery from relevance without removing him from office. Authority was withdrawn quietly. Access was reduced. Influence was rerouted. Montgomery kept his rank because firing him would have damaged the alliance. He lost his power because keeping it would have damaged the war. That outcome was not compromise. It was containment. Bradley and Patton were not appeased. They were acknowledged. Their condition was met in practice, not in rhetoric. From that moment on, no American army would operate under Montgomery's command unless circumstances left no alternative. Montgomery never recovered from that restriction. He remained visible. He remained decorated. He remained celebrated in Britain. But the command rooms that mattered no longer required him. Decisions were made elsewhere. Momentum moved without him. This was not a punishment designed to teach a lesson. It was an adjustment designed to end a war. The alliance did not fracture. It adapted. Montgomery believed history would remember confidence. History recorded consequence. The case is closed. If this examination clarified something you were never told about how wars are actually managed, leave a comment. If you want more investigations where command decisions are weighed by outcome rather than reputation, subscribe to the channel. There are no heroes in the command room, only decisions and the damage they leave behind.